Welcome to the Meristem Minute. We are going to kick off this Meristem Minute with Eric Winans as our key expert speaker. He's really going to focus on foliar nutrition and in that fungicide pass and even beyond the fungicide pass, and helping us understand how we can feed the crop better to achieve those higher yields. Take it away, Eric.
Yeah, thanks, Melanie. Yeah, when it comes to in-season crop management, the point that I always try to get across is that our yield potential is already made. The yield potential of an individual any given hybrid is at the highest whenever that seed is still in the bag, and then when we drop seed at the time of planting, that governs yield potential in terms of the amount of ears we potentially have per acre. But now, as we get to this in-season crop management phase, it's all about protecting that yield potential or assisting that plant to overcome stresses at key developmental timings and assist that plant in moving nutrition and photoassimilants into those developing kernels and growing points. When we're thinking about fungicide applications, we've really seen, especially with some of these pathogens, and the fungicides that we have, these fungicides are preventative fungicides. They don't correct an issue that may already be there. And so we've really seen that a double application pass tends to be the most responsive in terms of extending or both, protecting that crop and then also extending photosynthetic capacity. And so that first timing happens right around that V12 to V10 or to VT stage. And in that stage, that's when that crop is in that most critical phase where water use is at the highest demand. We know that our fungicides, they can slow respiration. They can help regulate water use in the plant. This year at the research farm at Pleasant Plains, we were really dry through those stages as we got to that tassel stage. And fungicides really help with plant health up to that point. But then there's also that kind of second phase I like to look at, and that's how can we assist that plant in filling those developing kernels by adding kernel weight. And so an application around that R2 growth stage with nutrition can really be important to, one, overlapping the residuals of our fungicide application, and then, helping that crop with that, that stay green effect that we see. So we've seen with some of these fungicides that we can actually extend the kernel filling period. So we can actually extend the growth of the crop, or the life cycle of the crop. And the reason why it's doing that is, that canopy after tassel timing will begin to produce ethylene, which is that hormone that will signal to that plant, hey, we need to begin this senescence process. Well, fungicides can actually, especially your strobilurine fungicides, can block or slow the production of that ethylene and extend that photosynthetic capacity later into the growing season. Now, with soybeans, they're a little bit different with corn, especially the varieties that we have in our region here in the central states. They tend to be indeterminate types, meaning that they go through both vegetative and reproductive growth at the same timing, as opposed to corn, where once it puts that tassel out, it's no longer growing vegetatively, it's just focused on that reproductive growth. But with soybeans, that most critical phase where we typically try to get that fungicide application on is around that R2 R3 growth stage. And there's a couple reasons for that. One, that's that point where we have the most trifoliates exposed, so we get good coverage of that fungicide there in the middle of the canopy. But it's also in that key phase of that flowering phase, R2 to R3, that crop has the potential to set a very high number of blooms or flowers, but it will actually abort anywhere from 60 to 75% of those flowers over that R2 to R3 growth stage. So anything we can do at that timing to assist that crop to overcome stresses and hang on to those flowers will then add pods. But then there's also that second window that I really like to focus on, and that's that R4 to R5 growth stage. That's when pod development is at the highest rate, and then we're also beginning the development of seeds. So there's this very high demand for water and nutrition at that stage. And again, just like with corn, if we can overlap or extend our residual activity of our fungicides and then also supply nutrition at that stage to assist the movement of sugars into those developing pods and seeds, that's really important. Two nutrients that we really focus on, especially with a product like Homestretch NKB, we didn't just pick potassium and boron out of a hat and say, hey, let's pair these together. We picked them because they have similar uptake patterns focused around that reproductive growth, and they also carry out similar functions in the plant. If we look at potassium specifically, so 75% of the potassium in the crop, in a corn crop, will be taken up by that VTR1 growth stage. And the vast majority of that's occurring right between V10 and VTR1. So there's a short period where there's this huge demand for potassium. And even if I have high K soil test levels, there's scenarios if I have dry soils, or let's say I'm in a high density where I know I have a smaller root mass on an individual plant basis, I just can't pull potassium in through that plant quick enough. So an application of potassium foliarly at that stage is sometimes the best option to continue the movement or upregulate the movement of sugars in the plant. Now with boron, just like with potassium, there's a sharp demand for boron directly ahead of VTR1, and that's because boron is so vital for reproductive growth. And actually right between V10 and about V14 is where that peak demand is. That's just 1/5 of the growing season in a corn crop, but 65% of the total boron requirement of the crop will be taken up over that period. And the other unique thing with boron is, if we look at something like potassium or nitrogen, it will begin to remobilize or translocate that nutrient as we get into that grain fill stage, meaning that it's pulling it out of the leaves and stalk and relocating it into those developing kernels. Boron will actually begin to translocate a little bit ahead of grain fill because there's such a high demand for that reproductive growth. And then there's this second rapid uptake period of boron, and that's as we get into that grain fill stage between that R2 and R4 growth stage. And again, boron's really important for sugar movement and filling those developing kernels. So that's why there's that second uptake tick in boron at that timing. And so whenever I'm thinking about key nutrients with fungicide, we already talked about boron. And again, I laid out that it's because that peak demand is directly prior to tassel. When we apply boron, we see improved pollination and pollen viability. Boron's really important for cell wall structure and also cell division. We have a lot of cell division going on when we're developing that pollen. And then in flowers, the name of the game is preventing flower abortion. And when we apply boron, we actually see that we retain flowers and improve pod development that way. Zinc would be another element that's really important for holding on to flowers and helping that plant overcome stresses during that R2 to R3 growth stage. But then as we look down the road and we look, in soybeans, that R4 to R5 growth stage, or in corn, that R2 to R4 growth stage, we really want to assist that plant in moving sugars. And that's where boron really comes into play. Because boron is so important for cell structure and integrity, we see improved movement of sugars from source cells. Source cells would be cells in the leaf where photosynthesis is occurring, where we're creating those carbohydrates. Those sugars then need to be moved through the phloem and into the sink tissues, which would be the developing kernels or the growing point at any given time. And so when we have boron in check, we see improved movement of sugars into those developing kernels. And actually, we improve the response to our fungicide when we supply boron with that fungicide application. When we apply fungicide, we're aiming at a net positive increase in photosynthesis. We're trying to protect leaf area and then also extend the photosynthetic capacity of that crop later into that grain fill stage. If I can pair that with boron, I get a better response out of those extra carbohydrates that I'm creating through photosynthesis. Now, potassium, just like with boron, peak demand is right there ahead of tassel stage. And also like boron, it plays a key role in sugar loading and transport in the crop. It's involved in that potassium malate shuttle. A potassium cation will move across a gradient in exchange for a hydrogen cation, and that hydrogen cation will attach to a sugar and then move it down the plant. So it's kind of an exchange of charges in the crop that assists the movement of sugars down the phloem, and the potassium will also aid the movement of nitrogen and other elements up the plant into those developing kernels. Another key focus at this timing as we get into the seed development stage is nitrogen utilization and moving proteins into that grain. And so molybdenum is really important for that. In soybeans, it's involved in that nitrogenase enzyme, which is really important for nodulation and manufacturing nitrogen. But then in corn, it's involved in that nitrate reductase enzyme. So, we can bring nitrate and ammonium in through the roots in the plant, but those forms of nitrogen cannot be utilized by the plant. They have to be converted into amino acids and proteins, and that nitrate reductase enzyme is really important for that, and molybdenum is a cofactor in that enzymatic process. And we also think about, utilizing nitrogen at that stage. Sulfur is another key element that's really important for application at those later stages when we're focused at that highest demand for nitrogen movement in the plant.
Gosh, so much great information. So Eric, when I hear you talk about these nutrients and fungicide pass, I really think about the fungicide pass on corn being that VT focused, and then really R3 focused on soybeans. But, earlier you stated that we can have a key impact on those stages, but you brought up that we can have another key impact later than that, later than farmers are used to applying. So talk to us a little bit about, I think this message really fits that VT R3 pass, but talk to us about how this message fits that later pass as well.
Yeah, when we get into that grain or seed development stage, so in corn, that would be R2, R3, R4, that brown silk stage. And then in soybean, that would be about R4, R5 when we're, developing those pods and beginning the development of those seeds. That's where the sugar movement benefits of applying boron and potassium can be most capitalized on. We have to assist that plant in moving those photoassemblates into those developing seeds and kernels. And so that's where that later pass comes in. And we can also focus on fungicides at that timing as well for, a second pass. Again, I mentioned overlapping residuals. And then things like insecticide can be really important to focus on at maybe an R4 or R5 application in soybean. We have these pod and seed feeding insects like bean leaf beetle and stink bug. Those would be really important to control at that stage to help maximize our final grain weight.
So I'm going to catch you off guard here a little bit. In the industry, we see a lot of messaging right now about, going with one fungicide pass and pushing that fungicide pass later. So really focusing on tar spot and trying to prevent tar spot and pushing it later. And I know I'm a firm believer in that tassel application, that you can be much more impactful in that application. I think the same is with nutrients too, applying them at the right time. So talk to us a little bit about how you can be much more impactful with your nutrient and fungicide application with the right timing versus waiting till that later application based on tar spot.
Yeah. When we look at, the demands of the crop at key timings, we know that those periods of highest demand for most of our nutrients are in that rapid growth stage between V10 and about tassel stage. And that's where we can really assist that plant in overcoming any transient deficiencies. So, when I'm thinking about, something like tar spot, and we want to be ahead of the game with tar spot, we have to have overlapping residuals. I like an application maybe ahead of tassel around that V10 to V12 stage, especially in a dry year like this. I was targeting maybe a V12 to V14 application, but I moved that ahead to about V10 on the research farm because we were in this dry period. We knew that we had this huge demand for nutrients that we just really couldn't pull in through the roots because of our dry soil. So I think a late vegetative pass followed up by a pass right in the heat of grain fill is about our most responsive application, both for crop protection products and foliar nutrition.
So what I've heard from you today is that really it's a protect and defend, but continue to feed that crop. These crops in the rapid growth stage are so nutrient needy that the soil can't provide enough. And so really continuing to feed, but doing that in a timely manner can really play a major impact, especially in kernel development and kernel size. So, you've brought up a lot of things. You've brought up the boron, the potassium, the molybdenum. You've brought up some zinc, and also sulfur was a key component I heard, especially in terms of soybeans. So What products are out in the marketplace that really fit these needs?
Yeah. So when I'm thinking about this stage, we're focused on, you know, eliminating stresses, assisting that plant to move sugars in those reproductive tissues, and then also, help the plant in utilizing nitrogen. And products like Homestretch with that zinc and manganese can be really important for eliminating stresses. Homestretch NKB with boron and potassium assists the movement of sugars. And then even something like sulfur 17 can be really important at this fungicide application timing to assist that plant with in utilization and manufacturing proteins.
Excellent. Well, gosh, what great information. Always good to have an expert that knows way more than I do talk about things. So thank you for your time and information. And with that, that is your Meristem Minute.